The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Ah, the web tour. Those that both creators and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's up, Timmy? This is how you deal with weird!
No! Do not harm my children!
Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket's in trouble, Akasa! Can we turn on the wind show remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and actually this is not just another episode. This is our Tits Out holiday super special episode. I did one of these last year, and I feel like I wanted to do another one, frankly. But it's a time of year where I wanted to give a gift to all of you, the Tits Out Brigade, because it's been a wild year for this podcast. Statistically, there was an increase of, according to the analytics I was looking at, 999% increase of listeners, people from all different countries, which is really exciting to me. I mean, there's already people, the OGs, who you are, the people who listen to this podcast, it started in November 2019. So this has really, truly been a Corona cast, really. Anyway, thank you all for listening. This is my gift to you, this episode. And yeah, so just briefly about the whole people listening from all different countries. What's fun about getting these sort of end of year statistics from Spotify and from other places is I can see where people are listening from. And it's just an ever increasing, I could never list every single country that people are listening from. But I think it's amazing that people are listening from all different places to this podcast. And I'm not going to say that this is literally my goal, but it's something that's on my mind, is that I would like to eventually do an episode about a scandalous woman from each and every country where there is a listener. And with that in mind, today we're going to be looking at a woman from Sweden. And so this topic was suggested by a friend of the pod, Kim, who is in Sweden. Kim very graciously also helped me out as Swedish cultural consultant because turns out until a week or two ago, I knew zero about the history of Sweden, and now I know a little bit, thanks to Kim for pointing me in the right direction. But who we're going to be looking at today is Princess Cecilia of Sweden. And I want to give you a non-spoiler warning, I guess, which is just like, rest assured, I chose this person to profile in this episode because it's a nice story. She is not at any point thrown in jail. She is not executed. She is not, trapped in a tower for 40 years and then slowly dies of self-inflicted starvation. Like, it's a good story. Last year, the festive spectacular was Lettice Knowles. And I think this is sort of in a similar vein of just like a woman who lived tits out, and just because of her own tenacity, but also just kind of luck and who she was around, she managed to live to a pretty decent old age. And not too much. It's not a bummer. The last season I did, like not the Fredigan episodes and stuff, but the season before that, full of bummers. And this is just like a good heartening story, so pour your hot beverage in your festive mug, wrap yourself in a blanket, sit by your fire, and let's listen to the story of Princess Cecilia of Sweden. So the only reference I have for this is Wikipedia, because as it turns out, there are not any easily findable English language records about Cecilia of Sweden, which is a first for me. I've always been able to find a couple, articles, ideally a biography, but this is, luckily, the Wikipedia article has lots of stuff. And then I did a lot of cross-referencing with other Wikipedia articles to learn more about her father and her brothers, the castle we're going to hear about later. So anyway, thank you, Wikipedia. If you're thinking of making some year-end contributions, I personally make a monthly contribution to Wikipedia because they provide information that is useful. So if you, like me, are not familiar with the history of Sweden, we're going to explain a bit because you really need to know the situation, and especially about her dad, to understand just why she was so cool. So her name is, she's Cecilia of Sweden. So in Swedish, her name is Cecilia Gustavsdotter Vasa. She was born November 16th, 1540 in Stockholm. So she was the daughter of King Gustav I of Sweden and his second queen, Margaret. So who was King Gustav I of Sweden / what is the history of Sweden as an independent monarchy? So Gustav is considered to rank among the country's greatest kings, arguably the most significant ruler in the Swedish history. So, actually, here's another source I used. So friend of the podcast, Alison Epstein, author of A Tip for the Hangman, which, by the way, is out in paperback now. Great Christmas present. She does a newsletter called Dirtbags Through the Ages, which is very much a companion to this podcast. I think they work really well together, where she writes just kind of about historical dirtbags from the ages. Anyway, I'll put a link to how you can subscribe to this in the show notes. But I was telling her when I was researching Cecilia, and then she got hyped about Gustav. So she wrote about Gustav. And so I read her thing about him, and that helped me understand it a bit better. Anyway, so Gustav, so he lived at around the same time as Henry VIII. So just to put this in a time and place, Henry VIII was over in England. Gustav was over in Sweden. Gustav was not, born a prince who became the king. He kind of like seized the throne in this ski-based coup situation. But so Cecilia is the same age-ish, same generation as Queen Elizabeth I. So I just need to mention so what happened with Gustav, there was this thing called the Kalmar Union, which was a union of, so it was an agreement that unified Sweden, Denmark, and Norway under a single monarch. Gustav, not a fan of this. Various things happened to him, and eventually he just like strapped on his skis and decided to ski to take over and be the new king. And as he went, he sort of picked up followers and other people who supported him. So there was just like this crowd of people just like skiing through 16th century Sweden. And then they got there and he basically took over and they went. And then to commemorate this in Sweden, every year they hold a cross-country ski race in honor of this. That's called the Vasa Lopet, which means the Vasa race, because remember he's Gustav Vasa is like his last name. So they ski, as he did, 90 kilometers, brackets, 56 miles. It's the oldest cross-country ski race in the world, as well as the one with the highest number of participants. So it started in 1922. So ski-based revolution, that's the dad, is Gustav. And so as Kim pointed out, and this is like very important to understand and appreciate, Cecilia's whole deal is that Gustav is like very renowned as like the father of the country, like in a very serious sort of way. He's like, I was thinking about how I can compare him, knowing people are listening to this from various countries. I would compare him to like George Washington in the US meets Winston Churchill in England. Like, he's not just like a very notable leader who did a lot of stuff that was significant, but he's also very serious. Like, he's not a party king. So bear that in mind when Cecilia starts doing her thing. This is who her dad is. He also, just at the same time as Henry VIII, he was one who cut ties between Sweden and the Pope / Catholic religion. Like 3 months after Henry VIII did the same thing. So the Pope was probably just like, oh, what's going on? Why is everybody like dumping me? The Pope. So he's very important. He was also, again, this is not like the Gustav podcast, but he also was maybe a tyrant and other things. But basically, he's the founding father of the modern Swedish state. He got their independence from the other countries, etc. And he had a daughter called Cecilia. So in fact, he had a lot of children. So his oldest child was Eric. And then that was with his first wife. Then with his second wife, he had several children. I'm going to name them all because most of them become characters in the story. So Eric is the oldest. Then there's Johann, Katarina, Cecilia, Magnus, Anna, Sophia, Elizabeth, and Carl. And just so you know, all of the sons except for Magnus go on to become king of Sweden, because we get into sort of a bit of a Fredegund type scenario where just like the brothers all want to be king instead of each other, which is interesting to me because, you know, the whole Henry VIII being the prime example of this. It's like, oh, I want to have like a lot of sons. I want to have a lot of children. So like the succession is safe. But with Gustav's sons, it's like, well, if you have too many sons, they're all going to fight against and / kill each other. So do you want to have a lot of sons? I don't know. It reminds me of what happened with the Fredegunds, the men in that, where the brothers kept killing each other. Anyway, so Cecilia, part of a big family, and she was the second oldest daughter. So she and her siblings were primarily under the care of, I wanted to say like Kim in Sweden, super big help. I didn't want to be like, can you like tell me how to pronounce every Swedish name? So I'm going to do my best. And I hope all of Sweden is cool with me, maybe pronouncing some things a bit strangely, but I'm doing my best. So Cecilia and her siblings were primarily under the care of her mother's trusted nurse, Birgitta Lars Andersons, her mother's cousin, Lady Margarita, and the noble widow, Ingrid Emmundsdotter. So when Cecilia was 11, her mother died, and then the siblings were placed in the care of basically some other people with cool Swedish names. Eventually, the father got married for a third time. He mostly married for the third time, from what I can tell, just so he would have a mom for the kids, because he didn't have any more children with the third wife, whose name was Katarina. Growing up, Cecilia was described as the most beautiful of Gustav's daughters. She's frequently mentioned because of her beauty, so sort of like Queen Margot vibes. Not as much as Queen Margot, where like everyone else was kind of like weird looking, but she was the most beautiful. And I think I think this is again like that Cleopatra thing of like, she was probably, yes, very beautiful. There's portraits and stuff, but I think she also just had like a personality and a charisma that really turned her maybe from an 8 into a 10 because she was so captivating. So when she was 16, she and her sisters each had their portraits painted and their personal qualities described in Latin by the court poet Henricus Mullerus, and they were presented on the dynastic marriage market. So it's like, hey, guess who's eligible to be married now? All the daughters of Gustav. So that same year, so there's, like everywhere in this era, the 16th century, like we've got Sweden, but there's a lot of like little kingdoms, or not even kingdoms, like just little areas with their own like local rulers. You know, things weren't really like the country borders that we would know now in the 21st century. So part of Sweden is East Frisia, which is a historic region in the northwest of Lower Saxony, Germany. Gustav presented them with a trading treaty and a marriage alliance. So they were basically like, who would you like to marry of my 2 oldest daughters? So Edzard, which is a great name, the Count of East Frisia, visited Sweden to meet Cecilia and her older sister Katerina, so he could choose which of them he wanted to marry. So like, I guess he saw the portraits, he read about the personal qualities, and he's like, I can't decide. So he met the 2 sisters, and he decided to choose to marry Katerina, the older sister. So she was 19, Edzard was 26. At this point, Cecilia is 18. So Katerina and Edzard got married in Stockholm in 1559, and then they left to go to East Frisia, which is where he was from. So they were accompanied by Katerina's sister Cecilia and Edzard's brother Johan. So Johan is 20 years old, Cecilia is 18 years old, so it's just kind of this like double date. Well, not double date, because I mean, Johan and Cecilia are just there as siblings, they're not another couple, or are they? So they all went and they stayed at Vadstena Castle, which is, I'm going to tell you a bit about Vadstena Castle because it's interesting and it's still a place you can go and visit. So it's in Vadstena, which is a place in Sweden, in the province of Östergötland in Sweden. So Vadstena Castle had been built, so where are we? It's 1559. So construction of it began in 1545 as a fortress to protect Stockholm. The fortress consisted of 3 smaller stone buildings, ramparts, a courtyard, a moat, and 4 circular cannon turrets. So actually, when Gustav got married for the 3rd time, he married Katerina in Vadstena. In fact, one of the castle's banqueting halls is called the Wedding Hall, although the construction wasn't finished in time for the wedding. And then it was changed from a fortress into a habitable castle. And so Magnus, who is one of the brothers, so there's Eric, Johan, Katerina, Cecilia, Magnus. So he's like 2 years younger than Cecilia. So Magnus became the Duke of Östergötland, and that's where he lived. And so that is where they went to stay with him. And this kind of sounds like currently still under construction. Fortress turned castle. So the double date siblings pairs went to Vadstena Castle to hang out with Magnus, their brother. So Magnus, a note on Prince Magnus. He was 16 years old at this time. Duke of Östergötland. He will become, spoiler, the only son of Gustav who didn't eventually become king of Sweden. And why is that? Because he's older than some of the other boys, but it's because he had a mental illness. Not sure what that was like. Again, not a lot of English language sources about this. So eventually, I don't know if it's like, he just had some issues where eventually like his fiefs were taken over by his brother, who managed him as a guardian because of Magnus's like mental condition. I don't know if it's like head injury or if it's like, you know, some sort of like thing that presented later in life. Many ballads and stories were inspired by Magnus and his alleged interest in mythological creatures such as fairies. There are many stories about, quote, the Mad Duke, For instance, about how he saw a mermaid in the castle moat and threw himself out a window, nearly drowning himself. There's no proof that this event ever took place, but the story might have evolved from an incident where he fell in the moat during the construction of the castle drawbridge. So that's Magnus, and that's Vadstena Castle. But now it's time for what happens at Vadstena Castle. So we've got 16-year-old Magnus in his fortress-turned castle, and his two sisters are there along with Edzard and Johan. And it is here that the first major scandal of Cecilia's life occurred, known as Vadstena Bullret, aka the Vadstena Thunder. Now, this is a scandal with a name. This is where I was already into the Cecilia situation, but the Vadstena Bullret. It's like how, all the political scandals now are called whatever gate after Watergate. This is a scandal so major it got a name, which is the Vadstena Bullret, the Vadstena Thunder, and here's what happened. So, before this totally not double date honeymoon scenario, Gustav had been reluctant to let Cecilia come along on this little trip. Maybe he knew that she was already kind of a mischievous person. There were at the time negotiations of a marriage between her and Georg Johann of Palatine Valdense. I don't know who or what that is. He wanted her to return early and not go on this cool teens road trip. He also asked Katarina and Edzard to remain in Sweden for the winter. But they're just we're cool teens, we're going to go on a trip, whatever. So, whilst at Vadstena Castle, the palace guards observed a man climbing in through the window of Cecilia's bedroom. This happened 4 times in a row. So, presumably 4 nights in a row. After, I love that they waited. They're like, ooh, did a man just climb to the window of the princess's bedroom? Maybe, but let's just see if it happens again. That happens again. It happens again. So after the 4th time, they informed Prince Eric, her eldest brother, who I guess was there too at Vadstena. So then Eric was like, what do I do? So he asked Magnus and his courtiers to advise him, which is wild because he's like, Magnus, you're 16 years old. What should we do? So they decided to keep Cecilia's window under guard so the man in question could not be in a position to deny the matter if he was caught. So they sprang, a trap was sprung. So then the same thing happened again. On the night of December 13th, Eric sent guards to arrest the man. So when they entered Cecilia's bedroom, they discovered it was not just any man. It was, in fact, the groom's brother, Johan, and he was in the bedroom without his trousers on, which I don't think people wore trousers at this time. I think they more a doublet and hose. So, but basically, sounds like nude from the waist down, whatever sorts of trousers he was wearing. Eric had Johan imprisoned, interrogated him, and then sent him to Gustav to decide what to do. So Gustav, who's, remember this, George Washington / Winston Churchill, very serious father of Sweden, he ordered Johan to be imprisoned in a different castle. 3 days later, Katarina and Edzard, remember they're married, they were sent to a third other castle and placed under house arrest. I'm not sure why, because they help facilitate this in some way, I guess. Eric and Cecilia herself were both recalled to Stockholm, I guess, to be yelled at or something. Cecilia, at this point, accused her father of having beaten her and ripped her hair off. Again, without a secondary source, that is equally possible and not possible. Gustav was a very serious man, he skied for whatever it was, 90 kilometers. If his daughter did this Vadstena Bullret, he might have freaked out at her in a physical, abusive way. He was mad at everybody, basically, Gustav. He was mad at Katarina. He was mad at Eric, the brother, for not having restrained Cecilia as they should because they're her older siblings. He was also mad at Eric for having caused the scandal by his way of handling the whole affair by ignoring it and then exposing it in public. He wanted, I guess, Eric to just go, not bring guards in and stuff, but just to reprimand Cecilia. And yet Gustav, not impressed with his children's handling of the Vadstena Bullret. Katarina, the oldest sister, she was allowed to see the king that subsequent June. She acted as a mediator and tried to get freed, because remember, she was in house arrest, and so was her husband, and so was her husband's brother, the one with the trousers down, Johann. Katerina also protested against the confiscation of Cecilia's jewelry. Wow, so part of Cecilia's punishment for this whole thing was to have her jewelry confiscated. Pretty major. Katerina also asked her stepmother, also named Katerina, to speak for them and to defend them. It sounds like Katerina, the older, did do that as well. Everyone's just like begging, pleading Gustav, like, can we just let everybody, basically everybody, your children's spouses, the in-laws, can we just like release all these hot young teens from jail in general? So Johann, again, trousers down Johann, he was the something of East Frisia. He had connections. So his mother sent ambassadors to Sweden to try and negotiate Johann's release. Eric suggested that Cecilia and Johann be forced to marry each other, but Gustav did not like the idea. And then the same summer, eventually, after all of this negotiation and mediation, Johann was released after having been forced to swear before Gustav and the royal council nothing sexual had taken place between him and Cecilia, despite him having been in her room 5 nights in a row with trousers down. And maybe it didn't. I don't know. Who's to say? Did Cecilia welcome him into her room? Also don't know. What we see of her later, I feel like she probably was cool with it. And then Cecilia's brothers, like, they wanted to say like nothing had happened between Johann and Cecilia, so they stamped a coin. This is like a pretty major thing. Like, it's again on par with like skiing to take over a country. So her brothers came together. They had a coin made. I don't know if it was just one coin or like if this was like a circulating coin lots of people could have. Anyway, the coin pictured Cecilia as the biblical heroine Susanna in the bath, which the meaning of this coin was to say that Cecilia was as innocent as the legendary Susanna in the Bible. So if you don't know that story, side note on Susanna in the Bible. So Susanna and the Elders is a story that's in the book of Daniel in the Bible. So I'm not a biblical scholar by any means, but I know that there's some stories that are like in some religions accept them, and then there's some stories that like some religions don't accept them. There's like apocrypha, which are like, anyway, so Susanna and the Elders is a story. So it is accepted as part of the Bible by the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Church, but not by the Protestants. It is not included in the Hebrew Bible and is not mentioned in early Jewish literature. So like, who wrote this story? We don't know. But this is the story. So also this is a story that my favorite painter, Artemisia Gentileschi, memorably painted. She did a lot of paintings of kind of what I would call tits out heroines of the Bible, Artemisia Gentileschi. Anyway, who was also around, I feel like, not at the same time as Cecilia, but shortly after. So this is the story. Susanna, she lives in ancient Bible times. She's bathing in her garden, because that is how you bathe in ancient Bible times. She sent her attendants away, and she's just like bathing nude in her garden. 2 elders, like 2 old men, bump into each other when they spy on her bathing. So these 2 men are just like, oh, hey, you're here also, like spying on Susanna bathing, like, haha, what a coincidence. They both lust for Susanna. When she makes her way back to the house after bathing, they grab her and demand she have sex with them. When she refuses, they have her arrested, claiming that the reason she sent her maids away was to be alone as she was having sex with a young man under a tree. But in fact, she sent her maids away so she could bathe by herself and just like have some peace and quiet. She refuses to be blackmailed and is arrested and is about to be put to death for adultery when young Daniel interrupts the proceedings, shouting that the elders should be questioned to prevent the death of an innocent. So the 2 men are separated and are cross-examined about details about what they saw. But it's like in that improv game. So you have to make something up and hope that it matches with what the other person said. So the thing is that they disagree about, because remember they said like Susanna was having sex with a man under a tree. And then both the men were asked like, well, what kind of tree was it? And the first says that it was a mastic tree. And the second says they were under an evergreen oak tree. And these two trees are wildly different sizes. So it made it obvious that the two men were lying. The two men are put to death. Virtue triumphs. Susanna is cool. And so the brothers are basically saying Cecilia is as innocent as Susanna in the Bible. Here's a coin that says so. So I guess that made everyone agree. And that is the Vodstina Bullrut. So, you know, the years go by. Gustav passes away, I think of like a leg infection or something, not especially heroic. The king is now Eric, the oldest brother of Cecilia. Cecilia, still not married, so her next youngest sister is Anna, and they were supposed to have been married off to two men from influential German families, but because of the Vodstina Bullrut, Georg Johann of Palatine Valdez chose Anna over Cecilia because Cecilia was kind of like scandalicious and he didn't want that in a wife. In 1561, she was proposed by the Earl of Arundel, not Arundel from Frozen, a movie that takes place in Norway. I looked that up because I was like, wait, is this? Because I read about Arundel. I'm like, wait, was Frozen inspired by oldie times Sweden? No. Frozen inspired by oldie times Norway. Anyway, so Cecilia is proposed to by the Earl of Arundel, brackets, not the one from Frozen. Although maybe that Arundel is Norway. It's spelled differently from Arundel and Frozen. But that was where I was like, wait a minute, what's this Frozen connection? Anyway, Cecilia's like, I'm cool, I will accept this proposal of the Earl of Arundel, but Eric, who's the king / her brother, you know, he has to approve who she marries. He does not agree. Cecilia is then proposed to by the Polish magnate Count Johann Tenczyski. Eric liked the idea, and according to Cecilia, he forced her to agree, but these plans also did not materialize. So Cecilia, age now 23, so that's like 7 years post Vodstina Bullrut, is found to be by Eric to be having a party in her rooms with her sister. I don't know if it would be Anna if she was married by this point, or if it was the next youngest sister, Sophia or Elizabeth. Basically, all of them. So Cecilia, 23 years old, living her best life, partying in her room with her sisters. The two of them fought. Due to this incident and Vodstina Bullrut, Eric issues a new protocol for the royal court in which his sisters were to be placed under a more strict observation to prevent them from damaging the reputation. So they weren't allowed to leave the palace at night or early morning, and they couldn't accept guests at night or letters without permission. And this is like the 12 dancing princesses, but just 3 princesses, but also dancing and being told to stop. Eric accused Cecilia of mixing with questionable people. His rules also banned the princesses from receiving supplicants. They were forbidden from meddling in politics on behalf of people or to any way interfere in affairs of state. Cecilia, Anna, and Sophia, the sisters, had sent a letter of protest to Eric the same year regarding the imprisonment of their brother Johann. Oh, so Johann was the guy trousers down, but then same name, Johann, also their brother. So the thing is that Johann, their brother, basically wanted to be king instead of Eric. So he was rebelling or scheming against Eric, so he was put in jail. Cecilia, Anna, and Sophia, they're all on team Johann, so they sent a letter of protest to Eric being like, please free our brother Johann from jail. And this is where Eric is like, I made a new rule where princesses can't do anything. So it might have been like that was part of why he made the rule. Cecilia protested openly towards these regulations because they were bullshit. And I think you're getting a sense right now that she did not have any time for this sort of bullshit. 1 year later, age 24, Cecilia was married to Christoph II of Baden-Rodemackern, who was 3 years older than her. His job was, he was the Margrave of Baden-Rodemackern. What is a Margrave? A Margrave was originally the medieval title for the military commander assigned to maintain the defense of one of the border provinces of the Holy Roman Empire or of a kingdom. That position became hereditary in certain feudal families in the empire, and the title came to be borne by rulers of some imperial principalities. So he's a margrave. I think I said margrate. That was a typo that I then said out loud. Margrave is the name of his. So it's like a title the same way that earl or count or duke is, basically. So Cecilia, age 24, married to Christoph. They were married in a far less luxurious ceremony than that of her sister, and their match seems to have taken place without much negotiation. So I think maybe because Cecilia is such a scandalous person, Eric was just happy to find someone to marry her off to. There seems to not have been any political purpose behind the marriage, which is interesting. So was it a love match? Or was Eric just kind of like, I just need to marry you to someone, I don't know, this guy. Christoph seems like not a very good husband/person. So after the marriage, he returned to Rodemakern, where he's the Margrave, where he built himself a palace and led a wasteful life. So, but everything got interesting again when Cecilia and Christoph were sent on an official state visit to England. So the official purpose of this visit was Cecilia was to negotiate to try and convince Queen Elizabeth to marry her brother Eric. And so Cecilia had been corresponding with Elizabeth, sort of as pen pals, for a while. They were like similar age, both got along, I guess. So she arrived in the autumn of 1565, having traveled 400 miles by water and 750 miles on ice and snow to visit Queen Elizabeth. So they'd been in correspondence for several years. Cecilia seems to have felt admiration for her on a personal level. To prep for this, she had spent 3 years learning to speak English from English people who were in Sweden. I think it was like Cecilia and Elizabeth were pen pals / friends, and then because of this, Eric was like, ooh, I can leverage this to get Cecilia to negotiate a marriage contract between Elizabeth and me, Eric. So, but en route to England, Cecilia managed to sneak off to meet her imprisoned brother Johann. Eric already kind of knew that she was probably more loyal to Johann than to him, so he got his governor to keep her under supervision. But she kept just sort of like doing some like secret spy business as she was like making her way to England. So in the Duchy of Prussia, she asked the Duke to work with the Danish monarch to free Johann, and he agreed to do that. Then she went to East Frisia to visit her sister Katarina, where they also talked about Johann and how to free Johann. After Cecilia left, Katarina sent Eric a furious letter about how he's keeping Johann imprisoned. So Cecilia's just like stirring up shit en route to England. When she got to London, she was allowed to stay in Bedford House in London. So she was welcomed by Frances Sidney, the Countess of Sussex, and Mildred Cook, the second wife of William Cecil. Or was that Cecil? This is where it's like, wait a minute. So we've been talking about Cecilia, Swedish people, Arundel, self-contained group of people who I was learning all about. But this is where Cecilia becomes like a self-insert fanfic character into the court of Elizabeth. Like, we're going to hear about a bunch of people you already know about. So this part, for me, I was like, oh, thank God, I know some of this stuff. So Cecilia made her formal entrance to London on September 11th, 1565, dressed in black velvet trimmed with silver. Amazing. Surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting dressed in red. Wait, picture this. This is like Lady Gaga Met Gala. So Cecilia arrives, beautiful, black velvet trimmed with silver, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting dressed in red. This is like festive, wintry glamour. And they're friends. So Elizabeth came to visit Cecilia at Bedford House. According to the Spanish ambassador, Cecilia and Elizabeth got along very nicely. They became instant BFFs. They were pen pals, and now they're real life friends. They visited weddings and dinners together. That Christmas, 1565, Cecilia, they went to Christmas Mass. And you know, in when you receive communion, you get like the little bread at church. Usually the priest gives it, but guess what? Cecilia received communion directly after Elizabeth. So that was like pretty major that she was right after her. You might be wondering, what about her husband, Christoph, who sucks? So Christoph was given an allowance as long as he allowed Cecilia to remain in England. So he was like, great, I like money for gambling and wasteful living. So he was cool with all this. So she gave birth to her first child while she was in England, and she let Elizabeth name him. So Cecilia's first child is called Edward Fortunatus, which is like, now we know what Elizabeth would have named a son if she had a son. At his christening, Elizabeth carried the baby. So I feel like, I don't know if she was specifically the godmother, but these two are like close as close can be. But remember how the purpose of this was supposed to be Cecilia visits to convince Elizabeth to marry her brother? Like, she basically did not do that at all. She was just like, I'm going to hang with my bestie and just wear glamorous outfits and be in England, and who cares? So I love this. This is a great Cecilia moment where she's just like sent there officially on Swedish court business, but I think it's like she wanted to visit Elizabeth, but then she found a way to make it be a work trip. So then Eric let her go, but then she like didn't do the work at all. She was also sent there to try and recruit English pirates to attack hostile Danish, German, and Polish ships on the Baltic Sea. Did she do that? Maybe. Not sure. Didn't say in Wikipedia. But we're getting into some piracy stuff, which is like gonna be great. So Christmas, christening, January. Eric gave her an additional task of negotiating an alliance between Sweden and England to assist Sweden in its attempt to have peace in the war between Sweden and Denmark. There are conflicting reports as to how she managed these negotiations. So again, like, did she care about that, or was she just like too busy, like just being besties with Elizabeth and hanging out? I feel like the latter. Anyway, so there are some reports that she did like try to be like, hey, Elizabeth, do you want to marry my brother Eric, who like I hate? So allegedly, maybe she tried to go through Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's, we all know this, boy toy / unrequited lover. So I guess she'd be like, hey, Robert Dudley, can you tell Elizabeth to marry my brother Eric, who I hate? And Robert Dudley would be like, no. And she'd be like, okay, I tried. So Cecilia's own agenda included trying to get Elizabeth to interfere in the matter of Johann, still in jail. And in fact, Elizabeth wrote to Eric and asked him to release Johann. Cecilia was also in contact with the Spanish ambassador at the English court because Christoph's lands were partially placed in Spanish Luxembourg. But then the friendship, much like Samantha on Sex and the City, just kind of ends here. So the relationship between Cecilia and Elizabeth was damaged because of Cecilia's close contact with the Spanish ambassador and because of the scandals caused by her debts. Debts? Yes. So Cecilia acquired enormous debts because she felt it was necessary to live a certain lifestyle according to her status at court. Like, she is a princess, the wife of a margrave. So she was spending beyond her means. Christoph, so she'd been in England for basically a year. And then Christoph was forced to leave for Germany in an attempt to borrow money for her so she could keep buying, I don't know, furs and jewels or whatever. Her greatest creditors were these two men, George North and Johann Diamond. She also used the Dr. Cornelius Alternatus, who borrowed her money and pawned things for her. So she, I guess, spent a lot of money on furs and jewels and then got this guy to sell them so she could have more money to buy more furs and jewels or something. Alnatanus had previously been exiled from court by Elizabeth for trying to convince her that he could make basically straw into gold. Elizabeth imprisoned him after he violated her order not to have anything to do with Cecilia. So maybe she was like, oh no, my poor little innocent friend Cecilia is being scammed by this guy. But in fact, Cecilia was using this guy to pawn her stuff so she could rack up more debts. And then, so that was November. The subsequent March, Christoph returned to England in secret and tried to abduct Cecilia to free her from the creditors, but was discovered and put in prison by the creditors. Elizabeth had him freed, but this definitively ended the friendship between Cecilia and the Queen when Elizabeth realized that Cecilia was kind of a grifter and kind of a mess, and she didn't need that in her life at that time, which, like, fair. Elizabeth had a lot going on at this time. This is, like, early in her reign. All the, like, guys are trying to make her not be queen anymore. She's got a lot going on. So 1 month later, Cecilia pawned her jewelry and wardrobe to finance their return trip to Baden, where Christoph is from, where he's the Margrave. But they were stopped in Dover. Most of their luggage was confiscated in the names of their creditors, North and Diamond. Not only was Cecilia and Christoph's luggage confiscated, but also that of Cecilia's ladies-in-waiting, who had no debts. And Cecilia and her courtiers regarded themselves as having been subjects of theft, which they kind of were. She was pregnant again at this point, and when she finally reached Rodemackern, her son Christopher Gustav was born with some birth issues. He had some handicaps, and she blamed the creditors for this for the rest of her life, for having, I don't know, I guess stressed her out during pregnancy. And then, so what is she going to do next? So this is like a month-to-month saga at this point. So that was April. Let's see. So they returned to Baden Rodemackern, where she stayed for 5 years. There were religious wars in the Netherlands. Let's see. There was economic distress because of this. And then in 1569, the second half of Baden. So she's in Baden Rodemackern, but the other half of Baden is Baden-Baden. Was inherited by Christoph's young nephew and placed under the rule of his Catholic relative Albert V of Bavaria, who treated Protestants with brutality. That same year, her brother Eric was assassinated, and Johann, who's been in prison this whole time, took over as king. Cecilia wrote to her brother Johann, who became Johann III of Sweden, and stated that she feared for her safety because of like all the wars and stuff, and asked for permission to return to Sweden. Permission granted. So Cecilia and Christoph returned to Kalmar in Sweden. But do you know who else had also just arrived? Johann Diamond, her creditor, had just arrived with a fleet of 50 ships. The guy who had confiscated her property and that of the ladies-in-waiting. So she was given permission from Johann to arrest him. His fleet was then confiscated, and he spent 5 years in prison. So, like, big mistake, huge type moment. Christoph then left Sweden. He promised Johann he would provide Sweden with mercenaries to help with their ongoing war with Russia, but in fact he did not do that, and Christoph in fact never returned. So, like, good riddance, I guess. He just pieced out of this whole situation. So in Sweden, Cecilia was granted the city of Arboga as her personal fief. I guess all of her, like, the stuff she did for her brother Johann, now that he's king, like, this is all paying off. Because remember, she was trying to get people to support him. She was writing letters. And so Johann gave her a city. So she called herself the Countess of Arboga. She had the authority to manage the trading policy and the legal system and see to it that royal laws were respected. And she also managed certain taxation on import and export. So one of her missions in Sweden was to have her dowry finally paid to her, because when she married Christoph, she was supposed to have gotten, I forget, it was some huge amount of Swedish currency. Or like she and Christoph were supposed to have gotten that, but she'd never got it. Johann III could not afford to do so. But in lieu of money, he gave her a fleet of ships as a part payment of the dowry. And what did Cecilia do? She became a pirate queen. So she used these fleets of ships to attack ships on the Baltic Sea. Johann had several licenses issued to pirates on the Baltic Sea with permission to attack ships on their way to Russia, to disturb Russian trade during the war between Sweden and Russia. Cecilia came into conflict with Johann because she violated her permission by also attacking ships from friendly nations like Danish people, and this created tension between Sweden and Denmark. So the lesson of this is, like, don't give Cecilia a fleet of pirate ships and expect her to follow the rules, which, again, I love about her. So then a plot was prepared by a guy called Charles de Mornay to assassinate Johann, who is the king / her brother. So Charles de Mornay was also, fun fact, the guy who back in the day had been the one who caught Cecilia with pants down Johann in the Valdina Bullthreat. Oh, I forget how you say it. Anyway, in the Valdina Thunder scandal. So anyway, this guy's been around for a while. Charles de Mornay. He was in contact with Christina of Denmark and the French ambassador in Copenhagen, and they wanted to assassinate Johann for various reasons. Their plan was that Johann would be killed during a swords dance performed by Scottish mercenaries before the Scottish mercenaries depart to the Baltic. I'm not sure if they're going to come in and dance with swords and then with the swords, then kill him with the swords, but that's what I imagine they mean. After the assassination, the plan was that Charles de Mornay, who had been the favorite of Eric, would be placed upon the throne as the new king. However, the plot did not materialize because, I don't know, the dancers did not... Whatever. This did not happen. Then the plot was revealed. Charles de Mornay was arrested, interrogated, and executed. It was never made clear who participated in the plot, but it is noted that suspected conspirators often gathered at meetings in the apartment of Princess Elizabeth, who is one of Cecilia's sisters. And Cecilia herself had frequently been seen at these meetings. So Cecilia and her sister Elizabeth and their brother Charles were somewhat compromised because they were maybe involved in this scheme, although they were never accused. So I don't know, like Cecilia rode hard for Johann for a long time, but if she was mad about him over the piracy stuff. Anyway, clearly she's turned against him. So Johann suspected her to have prepared a rebellion against him. In 1573, he gave order that Cecilia was not to be allowed in Stockholm Castle during his absence. And in 1574, after the plot had been exposed, he gave orders to governors in Östergötland to keep Cecilia under watch and not to let her have access to any royal castle. So this is a part where it's like, had she been male or had women been allowed to inherit the throne, I feel like Cecilia would have maybe seized it herself, but instead she's just kind of supporting people, just kind of freelance chaos, just whatever's best for her. She's pirate, ex-best friends of the queen. She's just living her best life. And this is where I was like, what a great story. 1575, Christoph, her husband, remember him? He just pieced out forever. He died, so now she's a widow. So her young son, Edward Fortunatus, remember who Elizabeth named, formally succeeded him as the Margrave of Baden-Rodemakern. But he was in Sweden, so it's in absence. He's the Margrave in absence. According to the marriage contract, Cecilia was allowed to be regent should her son succeed while still a child, which happened. But after Christoph dies, her in-laws had documents which secured her, which confiscated her rights, and took control over the entire place, Baden-Rodemakern, officially as guardians and regents of her son. Cecilia, not going to accept that, so she sent representatives to secure her rights, but the representatives were turned away and her authority as regent was not acknowledged. At the same time, in a wild plot twist that makes us all go wait, what? Elizabeth, former best friend, offered Cecilia, newly widowed, the hand in marriage of Elizabeth's boyfriend, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. What is going on? So Cecilia was advised to decline by Johann, and she, even though she was scheming against him, also turned down. But also she's just no, I don't want to marry Elizabeth's favorite. What is happening? Why did Elizabeth turn to her former bestie to try and marry off Robert Dudley? Well, and a fun connection to last year's festive holiday spectacular. This was around the same time the rumors about Robert and Lettice were heating up. In fact, 3 years later, Robert married Lettice. So this was the same time, if you've listened to that episode, where Robert had this big party for Elizabeth at this castle where he flirted with Lettice, who was pregnant anyway. So this is a crossover moment where basically I think Elizabeth wanted to nullify the Robert Lettice situation, and she's well, what if I marry him to Cecilia, my ex-bestie? But that did not happen, obviously. Cecilia then converted to Catholicism as a way to secure her and her son's rights to the domains of Christoph. And then 2 years later, Spanish ambassador arrived in Sweden because Johann, still the king, wanted to make an alliance with Spain. There's just a lot happening here in countries about which history I know very little, but so it's all about the Swedish war against Russia. Basically, he wanted Spanish assistance. So he suggested that Cecilia, who is now a Catholic, could be made governor in one of the Spanish lands in Europe, preferably Luxembourg. So Cecilia invited the ambassador to Arboga, where she lives, and started her own negotiations with him. She didn't want Johann's negotiation. She's going to negotiate this herself. She supported the plans of making her Spanish governor and offered her pirate fleet. Remember, they're still hanging around. Like, she has a pirate fleet. She offered them to serve in the Spanish War in the Netherlands, but this caused a conflict with her Protestant brother Charles, who began to attack her fleet with his own. So now it's like sibling versus sibling pirate battles. Cecilia acted as a valuable informant to Spain. When Johann's negotiations with Spain failed, he became suspicious of what Cecilia was up to, and like rightfully so, because she was definitely going behind his back, getting things figured out for herself. Johann had the Spanish ambassador placed in house arrest and banned him from any contact with Cecilia. I love how every time any of her brothers find out Cecilia's doing something, they just like try and like ban Cecilia from doing stuff, ban Cecilia from seeing people, because it's like whenever she talks to anyone, like shit goes down. Like she was, again, I'm getting Cleopatra vibes. She's just like clearly so persuasive and charismatic. However, Cecilia bribed her way into Stockholm in secret and attempted to see the ambassador. She was caught. Cecilia and her retinue were captured by the guard and brought to Johann, which caused, quote, a great scene between the siblings. Shortly after, Cecilia went to Germany, and the Spanish ambassador was exiled. So, and when I say she returned to Germany, I mean she returned to Baden-Rodemakern, because she wanted to take control of her lands and wrest control of the place from her relatives in the name of her young son. So hold on. I didn't tell you the name of the Spanish ambassador. His name is Francisco de Ireso. And I said that he was exiled, but here's what I just misinterpreted, and I'm just going to explain to you now, which is they actually left together. So, in fact, Francisco and Cecilia lived together in Baden for a time before he continued on his way to Spain. During this time, she gave birth to a daughter, which caused a scandal, as she had by that time been a widow for 4 years. So clearly the father was Francisco. So the daughter was placed in a convent by Edward Fortunatus against Cecilia's will. So even though that's his sister, Edward Fortunatus was just like, let's just like stow her away. She was not allowed to see the daughter again for a really long time, like decades. The daughter took the vows, like became a nun, and is known only by her nun name, Charitas. So we don't know what name Cecilia gave her daughter she had with the Spanish ambassador. So that just casts everything I just said about her and the Spanish ambassador in a whole new light, which was like, let me just look at this again. I'm just rereading the whole paragraph. So the Spanish ambassador arrived. Johann wanted Cecilia to negotiate with him. Clearly they became lovers, and then Cecilia started looking for her own best interests. What a story, honestly. So, yeah. In the struggle against Christoph's family / her in-laws, Cecilia was supported by Johann, but her other brother Charles broke with her after the birth of Charitas, because I guess that was just one scandal too many for him or something. But also it's just kind of like, which of her brothers supports her, which of her brothers does she support? This just keeps fluctuating like it does in families. So she had her sons placed in the care of Jesuits, because remember, she's Catholic now too. But her alliance with Spain eventually made her lose the support of Johann as well. In 1581, he refused to let her back into Sweden. Cecilia lived on the income of her Swedish estate, but then her estate was confiscated by Johann in 1585 because she opposed his marriage to someone called Gunilla Bielke. Why did she oppose the marriage of her brother to Gunilla Bielke? Because Gunilla was a noblewoman but not a princess, and Cecilia and the other siblings felt it was inappropriate for a king to marry a non-royal person. Let's see. So her son, Edward Fortunatus, came of age and he took control of Baden-Rodemackern. He confiscated Cecilia's lands. He also amassed a lot of debts. Cecilia, by the way, has been continuing to amass lots of debts here because that is just the lifestyle in which she lives. She became a diplomat. She courted various Catholic power holders on behalf of herself and her son in economical and political matters. So she's just traveling around being sort of a freelance diplomat, trying to get, I guess, money and power for her son. In 1596, this is like 8 years later, Edward Fortunatus was deposed by other family members. Again, similar to what happened with the marriage with Gunilla. So Edward Fortunatus married Maria von Eichen, which was an unequal marriage. Family members were so mad about that, / about him being Catholic, that some Protestant family members deposed him. So Cecilia continued trying to do the best for her and for her son. She's described as a talented diplomat with a great wit and verbal talent. I mean, I think we know. I think we know that she is very convincing in whatever she wants. So let's see. In 1613, she addressed the Imperial German Roman Assembly in Regensburg in favor of her second son, Philip, who had been imprisoned by the Protestants in Baden. Just a lot of drama happening in Baden. Cecilia, it says here, was often successful as she secured favorable sentences in her favor. Like she was. I think she would have been a very successful lawyer, frankly. She's just very persuasive. Let's see. She secured favorable sentences in her favor, but as the sentences could not be carried out, they were of little practical value. I'm not sure what that means, but it said that on Wikipedia. She was a target of Protestant propaganda for her conversion to Catholicism and political activity. The most known slander against her was a story by Everhard van Ried. He claimed that she hosted a brothel in Antwerp and that her son had to drag her from it by her hair. She's also compared to the Empress Messalina, who I talked about a bit in the Agrippina episode. Remember, there was a whole thing about, like, did she have a contest with a courtesan about who could have sex with more people in a day, etc.? So, you know, powerful woman. People are like, oh, but she's like, does sex things, and that means that she's bad. Like, we've seen and heard that before. Whatever. Cecilia was forced to support herself by loans due to her lack of income, and therefore was often hunted by creditors. In 1618, her estate was taken, and she fled by carriage to make contact with the Archbishop of Trier in Luxembourg. To escape her persecutors, she was literally forced to abandon her carriage and jump over the border to Lorraine. Upon the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, let's see, at this point, the Protestant line of the Baden dynasties, the people who had taken over from her son, were deposed by the imperial army, and her grandson, as a Catholic, so I'm not sure, the son of either Philip or Edward Fortunatus, was allowed to take control over the entire territory of Baden, so more power for her lineage. Cecilia was therefore allowed to return to her estate in Rodemackern and spent her last years in comfort there as the grandmother of the Margrave, I assume. Still, she passed away age 86 and is buried under the floor in the church in Rodemackern. And that is the saga of Princess Cecilia, the princess, pirate, diplomat, truly scandalous legend. I mean, frankly, I don't know a lot about Swedish history, but at this point, my favorite person from Swedish history, the saga of the Vadstena Bullret, which is a great, I love a scandal with a name. So we need to score her on the Fredegund Memorial Scandalous scale. Scandaliciousness is the first category on the scandaliciousness scale. Now, instinctively, I feel like 10. Like, come on. But I want to, think this through. So the evidence we have of her, there's Vadstena Bullret, major scandal. We have the way that she was going behind the back of her brothers all the time to wheeling and dealing. That's kind of more scheminess and scandaliciousness. There is, I don't know, scandaliciousness, like a 10 in scandaliciousness, that's really for people who murder somebody or who like, some sort of con artistry, but she was, in contrast to her father, like just the fact that her father, like again, picture Gustav as this like George Washington, Winston Churchill hybrid, the father of Sweden, and she's just like, I'm just gonna like go be a princess, pirate, / do whatever the fuck I want my whole life. You know what? And it's Christmas and I'm in a good mood, so I'm giving her a 10. 10 for scandaliciousness to Princess Cecilia because she's like icon status to me right now. Her scheminess, I think, is also very high. Like literal scheminess. Like she was friends with Elizabeth and then she was able to get like a business trip to England, but then she didn't do the business she was supposed to do. And then she just like was kind of grifting Elizabeth. And then the way that she like, then she got a pirate fleet and then she kind of went rogue with her pirate fleet. Like her scheminess, I feel like it was pretty high. And then also all the like diplomacy and stuff. Like she was scheming every day she was alive for 80 whatever years. Where I feel like she's going to lose some points or not gain lots of points is in significance. Because again, Kim, my Swedish cultural advisor, I was like, but how do we feel about her for significance? And Kim is like, I don't. Yeah, I mean, like her grandson became the Margrave of Baden Rodemakern, which is like cool. I feel like the chaos that she sowed was pretty iconic, but in terms of like significance of, world events, like if she had married Robert Dudley, that would have been pretty major. She didn't. Like, I don't feel her significance number is super high, and that's nothing against her. I just don't. In my heart, very high, but like in actuality, I'm going to give her a significance of like 5 because just the chaos she sowed in all of these wars happening, Sweden, Russia, like I'm sure there was an effect, but like the long-term significance of her, I don't see it. The sexism bonus is as per ever. This is interesting to consider because like Kim said, like if she had been a man, like she would have been king, no question. Like she would have like usurped, she would have strapped on her skis like her dad and just like taken over, but she was a woman, so she couldn't be a king. Her brothers kept like making rules so she couldn't just like have a good time. At the same time, I feel like she still did a lot of cool stuff. Like the sexism did not super get in her way the way it did for like SD or like people who were really inhibited from doing stuff. Like Cecilia was like, oh, you're going to just like make these rules against me. I'll just find a loophole and whatever, convince like another country to make you forgive me. I feel like her sexism, I'm going to give her a 6.5 for sexism. And frankly, I just remembered vis-a-vis scandaliciousness. Of course she deserves a 10. She ran off with a Spanish ambassador and had a daughter with him. Like her scandaliciousness score, I feel like it's Christmas, but also I think that she deserves and gets a 10. So this gives her, why did I give 6.5? This is harder to add. So it's like 26... 31.5. Oh, wow. This is actually quite high. So 31.5. Cecilia of Sweden. Honestly, this puts her 4th highest score ever, which I'm excited about. And I think, well, you know what? All the numbers I give are always subjective, but I feel happy about it. So like the top 4 currently on the Fredegund Memorial Scandalous scale. Fredegund has a 38. Queen Margot, 37.5. Joanna of Naples, 33. Cecilia of Sweden, 31.5. And then we're getting down to 5th place is a tie, a 3-way tie. Agrippina, Sophia Dorothea, and Elizabeth Woodville all have a 31. Like, I like this. I like the way that this is shaping down. Like the top 4, Fredegund, Queen Margot, Joanna of Naples, Cecilia of Sweden. Just women who just like did not give a fuck and like were able just through force of personality, but also I would say fortunately the people who they were around, they were able to outsmart, etc. They ascended to the top of the scale. So that is Princess Cecilia of Sweden / little bit about the history of Sweden itself. And I wanted to say, so I am excited about learning about people like Cecilia, people like Fredegund, people I had not heard about. I want to know who is like a lesser known scandalous person from the place where you live or the place where you are from, your city, your country, your territory, whatever you live. Like, please let me know, because when I, if you just like, sometimes I do, I'm like, what are some people I could talk about on the podcast? And I Google like, scandalous women from history. And it's always the same, like 5 people. It's like Marie Antoinette. I'm like, yeah, I could do an episode about her, but like, I want someone less famous. I want like the fact that Cecilia of Sweden has been here this whole time with a very lengthy Wikipedia page, and I've never encountered her until Kim mentioned it, is like, come on. Same with Fredegund. I'm like, wouldst that I had known about her before. So please let me know who is a scandalous person from where you're from. Somebody who's like lesser known, ideally, would be great. My DMs are open on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. If you're not on Instagram, my DMs are also open on Twitter at Vulgar History, or you can email me if you have like lengthier thoughts you'd rather email, vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. I truly want to hear from you, so please let me know who are some cool heroines. And it's also helpful if you give me at least a little bit of info about like why they're cool, just so I know. And if people send me like longer little writings, maybe I can like share those on the podcast, because I will say there's been some people who have suggested very interesting subjects to me before. Like, they've sent me messages or suggested them, whatever, and when I look them up, I'm like, oh, this is a cool person, but there's not enough to like talk about for an hour. Like, I want, for the podcast, I like to talk for like 30 to 60 minutes about whoever I'm talking about. But if it's like a cool person and there's not that much known, but they are cool, like, you just write me in a little description of what they were like, and I can read that as like a little mini episode or something. Who knows? It's really the planning of this podcast, like the life of Cecilia. I never know what I'm gonna do next, but it's gonna be awesome. So other things to remind you about. So like, for sure, I'm gonna do another season of the podcast in the spring, probably. So stay tuned for information about that. But in the meantime, if you want more episodes of vulgar history type things / me talking about stuff, you can join my Patreon page, which is patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. So if you know about Patreon, it's like you pledge a bit of money every month, and then in exchange you get extra stuff from me. If you pledge at least $5 US per month, then you get, every month I do one bonus episode on Patreon, which are called So This Asshole, where I talk about men who are awful. This month I'm going to be doing Charles Dickens, who, I don't want to spoil your annual reread of A Christmas Carol, but he was awful to his wife, and I'm going to be talking about that. Anyway, patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. You can also support the podcast / me by buying some of the merch, which is at vulgarhistory.store, vulgarhistory.store. Remember, you can use code TITSOUT for free shipping in the US, or TITSOUT10 for 10% off in the store. I'm thinking now I'd love to do some sort of Cecilia of Sweden inspired merch. Not sure what that would look like at this point, but I'll think of something cute, and you can look in the store and it'll be there. What else? My book suggestions, if it's like you want to know some good books to read about scandalous women from history, if you go to bookshop.org/shop/vulgarhistory, there's all the books that I've mentioned that I've used as resources are all there in my little shop. And when you buy stuff from that link, or in general from bookshop.org, a little percentage of that goes to me, which I also appreciate. And I guess that's everything. Instagram, Vulgar History Pod. Twitter, Vulgar History. Send me your stories at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. And yeah, it's been a wild year. I appreciate so much everybody who's been listening, everyone who's been like commenting, recommending this podcast to their friends. Like, I don't have advertising, so clearly it's just like a mixture of word of mouth and algorithms that's got this 999% increase of listenership. So I truly appreciate it. Keep your mask on. Tits out for 2022. And I'll talk to you all next timey.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth. Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Nowadays, trends and news cycles change faster than we can blink. But there are some things that withstand the test of time. And if you're looking for a connection to something timeless, and maybe also a glimpse of life at a slower pace, I believe everyone can relate to the very human experiences explored in Jane Austen's novels. And that's where I come in. My name is Alison Larkin. I'm a writer, comedian, and narrator and host of the Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin. I spent a lot of my childhood in the part of England where Jane Austen lived and wrote, and now that I live in the States, nothing gives me a sense of homecoming quite like narrating her books. On this show, you'll listen to award-winning narration. I'll give myself a pat on the back for that. As well as conversations with actors, writers, and other fascinating people who all share a passionate love for Jane Austen. So please, join me as we embark on a wonderful journey through Jane Austen's work. Be sure to listen and subscribe to the Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin, wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I'm the host and creator of Only One in the Room podcast. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's incredible Only One story. We talk to the realest of real people, dealing with issues like infertility, addiction, human trafficking, and body shaming. Oh, and we want to be fair, so we talk to some celebrities too. Oscar winners, New York Times bestselling authors, supermodels, and even the most decorated U.S. Winter Olympian. Everyone is invited to share their Only One story with our listeners. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone. Download Only One in the Room wherever you listen to podcasts today.